Hello, good evening, and welcome to our 57th step in our walking tour through the Bible and our next step through the book of Joshua. It's been a very hot day here in Hove. That's why I'm wearing a t-shirt. I'm Father Alexander, by the way. Now, I just want to look at chapter 6 of the book of Joshua, which deals with the taking of the city of Jericho. Now, you probably all know this story. It's a very famous story about how the walls at Jericho collapse after the Israelites have walked around them every day with the Ark of the Covenant blowing their trumpets. And then on the final day, they walk around 7 times. And then they make a huge war cry, whereupon the walls collapse and they go and take the city. Now, there are 4 aspects to look at here: scientific, geographical, historical, and religious. Yes, there is a religious bit to this too. Well, first of all, the scientific bit, which is the bit that's often sort of trotted out at this stage. I don't know if it's not true or not because I'm not a scientist, but it is said that if you walk around a structure in this manner, marching, the whole army marching and blowing trumpets, the vibrations will severely weaken the walls. And then on the last day, you do this 6 or 7 times, and then you make a tremendous shout. The walls will probably fall down because of the vibrations in the air, and the vibrations in the ground will cause the walls to collapse. Now, Jericho would have been made out of mud bricks, and so maybe they were particularly friable and particularly vulnerable to this form of collapse. So that's the story, isn't it? That, in other words, this story of the blowing of the trumpets and the walking around therefore makes some sort of sense. Okay, let's go on to the historical bit. Now, when the Israelites entered the Promised Land, Jericho, the oldest city on the planet, probably, the oldest walled city on the planet as well, Jericho at that stage was almost certainly uninhabited. Okay, so what was there at Jericho? There was a famous spring which produces lots of water, therefore it's the city of the palm trees. There's a lot of agriculture in Jericho. It's only 6 miles of the River Jordan, and therefore it would have been the first place they came to. Well, it was uninhabited, but what was there? Well, this is the geographical bit. There was a tell. What's a tell? Well, a tell is a sort of hill, but it's not a hill in the normal sense. It's an artificial hill. A tell is what you get when you build a town and then the town is destroyed. Then you build another town on the ruins, and then another town on those ruins, and another town, and so on and so forth. The most famous tell on earth is in Hisarlik in Turkey, and that is usually identified with Troy. So in other words, because certain sites were better than others, they built a town. After that town was destroyed, you built another town on top, and so on, until eventually you created an artificial mountain. Now, Jericho, even today, has this artificial mountain, which is the focus of all the archaeology in Jericho. It's called Tel Sultan, the King's Hill, the King's Mount. And next door there is Ain Sultan, the King's Spring, which is the reason why Jericho is there, because it has this water supply. Now, ancient Jericho was a really tiny place. And indeed, modern Jericho isn't much bigger. Modern Jericho is what we'd call a village, actually. But ancient Jericho, going right back, would have had about 7,000 inhabitants, probably. It was quite a small place, but it was obviously a very important place, and it was surrounded by walls. But at the time of Joshua, there was nothing there. Now, the tell has been excavated like a cake, and they've discovered the various different layers, the bottom being the oldest and the top being the newest, and they've been able to work out which layer is on what date and so on, which layer was destroyed by fire and so on and so forth. And certainly Jericho was destroyed many, many times, but probably, unless there's something terribly wrong with the dating, and it has to be said, some of these layers in the tell may only be a few inches deep, despite the archaeologists really are of the opinion that it was destroyed many a time, but it certainly wasn't destroyed by Joshua. So this story we've got about the taking of Jericho is what's called an etiology, a technical term. which means actually in modern English, a just so story. The Israelites came into the land, they saw this ruined city, and they said, aha, let us explain this ruined city. Well, you know, once upon a time when our ancestors turned up, Joshua, etc., walked around it 3 times, and God destroyed the city for us. So, in other words, this story of Joshua's destruction of Jericho is an explanation of a very important landmark in ancient Palestine. Now, that's rather important, and I'm not labouring this point for no reason. It's rather important. We're told that everybody in the city of Jericho is to be put to death. Everybody, men, women, children, old, young, with the exception of Rahab the prostitute and the people living with her clan, and that all the animals in Jericho are to be slaughtered. The gold and the silver in Jericho is to be preserved, and that will be going into the Lord's treasury, the treasury of the temple. The temple doesn't actually exist anymore. The tabernacle. Okay. Now, therefore, because Jericho was an empty site at the time of Joshua, we can be absolutely certain that this massacre of people in Jericho didn't happen. Which is a bit of a relief to us, because the idea that God placed the inhabitants of Jericho under a curse seems pretty hard for us Christians and us modern people to take on board. Of course, Rahab survives, and that again is an etiology, because it says something rather ridiculous. She's still living in Israel. In other words, it says she is still living in Israel even today, verse 25, 6:25. Well, she wasn't. What it means is the clan of Rahab, the descendants of Rahab, were still living. In other words, the people of Jericho, or associated with Jericho, were still there. They were Jews, of course, but they were the people who survived the supposed massacre of Jericho, which never took place, by the way. Okay, confused? Well, you shouldn't be. What I think we have here is the author of the book of Joshua wants to assume that the Israelites came in and wiped out the natives. The story of Rahab and the fact that there was no city to wipe out anyway at the time, seems to point to a more peaceful and a more gradual infiltration by the Israelites into the promised land, as opposed to a blitzkrieg and a war of destruction. Just a thought that obviously they wanted later to portray it as a war of destruction and a complete change, because they wanted later to point out, we, the Israelites, do not practice the horrible religions of Canaan, and there is clear blue water between us and the people of Canaan. But this is not necessarily the case. In other words, that the children of Israel do have something rather more in common with the people of Canaan than they might like. They might pretend to be completely different, outsiders who come in, but in fact they are outsiders who come in and to infiltrate gradually. That's just a theory. Okay, now I did say there was something religious here. Oh yes, the priests blow their trumpets, and as we know, the trumpet is a Jewish liturgical instrument, and they carry the Ark of the Covenant, which is the presence of God, around the city once every day and then 7 days on the last day. The parading of the Ark is obviously very important, and it's to show us that the force and the power that overcomes Jericho is in fact the force and the power of God. In other words, if you want to defeat the city of this world, or however you look at it, you must rely totally on God. The other thing that's really very important here is this idea of the religious procession. We have religious processions, not so much in England, where they have not really they were reintroduced in the 19th century. Religious processions are an incredibly important part of Catholic culture. And of course, a religious procession of what? You can walk around as much as you like, but the idea is you walk around carrying a statue, carrying a relic, or in this case, essentially, carrying the Blessed Sacrament, the Holy of Holies, the mobile Holy of Holies, the Blessed Sacrament. And carrying around the Blessed Sacrament is a very good thing to do. It's a very Catholic thing to do. And of course, it goes back to this episode here in the book of Joshua, chapter 6. They carried around the Ark of God. We too carry around the Ark of God. And that sanctifies the place where it is processed, but also it shows us that we confront the world through the power of God, in the power of God. Okay, hope that happens. It's an interesting chapter, isn't it? So that's Joshua chapter 6. All the best.